In the great palace centers of ancient Mesopotamia, administration was not limited to rulers and generals. Behind the visible symbols of authority stood a complex network of attendants, officials, and workers who sustained the daily life of the court. Some members of this staff were responsible for ceremony, protocol, and the formal behavior expected in royal environments. These individuals often belonged to the ruler's extended family, or to trusted followers who gradually became part of a courtly circle with flexible and sometimes undefined duties. Alongside them existed a more structured administrative group, likely drawn from the traditional urban elite, whose role focused on record-keeping and bureaucratic management. The thousands of documents discovered in the palace archives of Mari reveal an environment filled with administrative activity, suggesting a large and organized staff, although the exact size of this bureaucracy cannot be determined with certainty. Scribes formed the backbone of this administrative system. Their responsibilities included recording economic transactions, documenting government decisions, and transmitting information both within the palace and beyond its walls. Messages, orders, and reports moved through their hands, making them essential to communication across the state. It remains unclear whether these scribes functioned merely as secretaries, who wrote down dictated instructions and read incoming correspondence to senior officials, or whether they exercised independent authority within the administration. Evidence suggests that both roles may have existed simultaneously. Some high officials could not read or write, making secretarial services necessary. Yet in many cases, scribes likely combined literacy with administrative responsibility, participating directly in governance rather than simply recording it. The palace environment itself appears to have played a central role in cultivating literacy. In northern regions, where writing was less widespread among the general population, expertise in reading and writing was probably concentrated within royal institutions. Literacy thus became a specialized skill nurtured by the state for its own purposes. Earlier periods even suggest that the title of scribe functioned almost as a social category rather than merely a profession. Because written documentation shaped nearly every aspect of administration and economic life, many officials were likely trained in writing, reinforcing the importance of literacy within state structures. Over time, especially in southern kingdoms of the Old Babylonian era, this educated class may have filled the middle ranks of government, serving different regimes regardless of political change, even as royal institutions gradually reduced direct intervention in society and began to operate more like private economic enterprises. Beyond administration, the economic foundations of ancient Near Eastern societies rested on agriculture and animal husbandry. This region played a decisive role in the development of farming, as some of the earliest domesticated plants and animals emerged here alongside settled village life. Early agricultural communities, even without advanced metal tools or wheel-made pottery, were technologically sophisticated. Their finely crafted ceramics, carefully shaped stone vessels, advanced flint tools, and substantial architecture demonstrate a high level of technical skill. Archaeological research has often focused on the earliest stages of these farming cultures, exploring how humans first adopted new methods of survival based on cultivation and domestication. Yet less is known about later agricultural communities, particularly those that developed into large and prosperous settlements and eventually laid the groundwork for urban civilization. By the time early historical societies emerged in Mesopotamia, agriculture existed within a complex social framework shaped by the constant interaction between rural producers and urban centers. Cities influenced farming strategies, directing production toward their own economic needs. The cultivation of plants and the management of animals were not static traditions, but evolving systems shaped by technological demands and political pressures. Large animals provided essential power for transportation and ploughing, while their secondary products supported various industries. Agricultural practices, therefore, adapted to serve expanding urban economies. A defining feature of agriculture during the third millennium was the pursuit of increased production. As cities grew and elites demanded greater resources, farming methods shifted toward maximizing output. Two main strategies made this possible. One involved intensifying production on existing land through more frequent cultivation, improved fertilization, or mixed cropping. The other focused on expanding the amount of land under cultivation, often requiring new labor sources and changes in social organization. Newly cultivated areas frequently demanded different techniques, creating a dynamic and evolving agricultural landscape. Extensive administrative records from this period reveal how these policies transformed farming practices and reshaped rural economies. In southern Mesopotamia, marshlands rich in wildlife provided abundant natural resources. Fish, birds, and turtles were heavily exploited, and many wild plants were gathered for food or practical use. Because such environments offered plentiful resources, early farmers in the region likely introduced agriculture from elsewhere, bringing knowledge developed in areas more suitable for cultivation. Over time, farming techniques adapted to the conditions of the southern plains. Irrigated fields dominated the landscape, primarily producing cereal crops sown in autumn and harvested in spring. Smaller plots grew lentils and flax, while gardens produced vegetables beneath the shade of date palms and other fruit trees. A wide variety of herbs and spices was also cultivated, indicating a diverse and carefully managed agricultural system. Animal husbandry played an equally important role in the rural economy. Different species served distinct purposes, and their value was not always measured in terms of food production. Sheep were especially significant, primarily valued for milk and wool rather than meat. They were often raised together with goats, forming the most economically important livestock group. Cattle, by contrast, were mainly used for ploughing, providing the power necessary for cultivation. Pigs served primarily as a source of fat. Because land and water limited crop production, raising animals often offered farmers their best opportunity to accumulate wealth, and herd sizes varied widely among households. Sheep raising illustrates the close relationship between agriculture and pastoralism. Flocks grazed on the edges of cultivated fields and on land left fallow, contributing to soil fertility while feeding on available vegetation. Many farming families kept small flocks, which grazed near the village during most of the year. Larger flocks, however, often travelled long distances in search of pasture, accompanied by professional shepherds. Urban families also invested in livestock, entrusting animals to hired herders under detailed agreements that regulated responsibilities, productivity, and compensation. These arrangements reveal a complex system balancing risk and profit, reflecting the importance of livestock as economic assets. Large institutions such as temples and royal administrations managed enormous herds. Records from state archives show that thousands of animals were kept under official supervision, primarily for wool production, which was a major economic resource. Careful accounting tracked births, deaths, and productivity, demonstrating a highly organized approach to livestock management. Sheep also played an important social and religious role, serving as offerings in rituals and as valuable gifts in various transactions. Efforts to improve animal breeds further demonstrate the organized nature of agricultural management. Texts describe attempts to cross domestic animals with wild species to enhance desirable traits. Such practices required coordinated efforts, and long-distance transport of animals from mountainous regions, suggesting significant institutional involvement in agricultural innovation. Cattle shared many characteristics with sheep but served different primary functions. They provided milk and leather, yet their greatest value lay in their use as draft animals. Oxen pulled ploughs and enabled large-scale cultivation, making them essential to farming households. Because cattle required substantial food and care, families typically kept only a few animals. They were often treated as valuable members of the household, sometimes even receiving personal names. Their diet included grain and collected fodder, reflecting the considerable investment required to maintain them. Other draft animals also contributed to agricultural and economic life. Donkeys carried goods, pulled ploughs, and transported supplies across long distances. Hybrid animals created by crossing different species offered increased strength and speed, while horses later became valuable for transport and warfare. These animals supported trade networks and communication systems that connected distant regions. Pigs, although less prominent in official records, were present in urban environments and provided useful products such as fat. Archaeological evidence shows their widespread presence, even if written sources rarely mention them. Their relative absence from official imagery may reflect cultural preferences rather than actual scarcity. Plant cultivation remained the central pillar of the economy. Agricultural knowledge passed from generation to generation, emphasizing careful preparation of fields, maintenance of tools, and efficient planting methods. Fields were prepared through ploughing and irrigation before sowing, and specialized equipment ensured that seeds were planted in orderly rows. This systematic approach allowed farmers to calculate the precise amount of seed needed, the labor required, and the expected yield. The spacing of crops facilitated irrigation, weed control, and plant growth, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of agricultural efficiency. Must be kept clean, and water must be kept clean, and water must be managed with care. Weeds compete with young plants for moisture and nutrients, and irrigation can make the difference between a harvest that fills storage bins and one that barely covers seed for the next season. These tasks do not look dramatic, but they decide everything long before the sickles ever touch the stalks. In southern Iraq, the harvest season still falls in late spring, usually from late April into May. Barley ripens first, wheat a little later, and there can be slight differences from one district to another, but within a given area the fields tend to mature almost at the same time. That timing creates a familiar crisis. Too much work, too few hands. Every family wants to cut and gather quickly before wind, birds, or stray animals do damage. Yet labour is always limited, and at precisely this moment, the shortage becomes most visible. Large institutions did not wait for chance. Temples and palaces had claims on labour, and when their fields were ready, they could pull people into mass harvesting teams. In practice, this meant that institutional land could be reaped first, while private plots might be left until later, handled by whoever could still spare the time. Under those pressures, smaller households faced hard choices. A household might have land, seed, and tools, yet still lose the best harvest window because its labour had been redirected elsewhere. One contract practice makes this especially clear. Grain could be lent out before harvest, on the condition that the borrower would help reap the lender's fields when harvest arrived. On paper, it looks like a practical arrangement. Grain now, labour later. On the ground, it could become a trap. The debtor's strongest working days would be spent in someone else's field, exactly when the debtor's own crop needed attention most. In a farming economy, timing is a form of wealth, and losing timing can be worse than losing money. After the crop is cut, the work is far from finished. Sheaves must be stacked, then brought to threshing floors. where the grain is separated from the straw and chaff. Wind helps with winnowing, but the process still demands labour, animals, tools, and space. This stage is also when grain becomes visible as a measurable pile in the open, and visibility invites accounting. In many rural societies, the lean months come right before harvest. Food runs low, seed is protected, and borrowing becomes common. Once threshing begins and grain lies in heaps, repayment suddenly becomes possible, and pressure to settle old obligations arrives just as quickly. That moment is also a social checkpoint. Debts are paid, but new ones are often created. Tenants settle accounts with landowners. Shares are calculated. Disputes surface. A single season can end with one household free and another pushed deeper into obligation. Rural credit is not merely an economic tool, it shapes power inside villages. Legal rules tried to address the harshest extremes. Crop failure could happen without anyone's fault. Floods might break canals, storms might flatten the plants, or a sudden rush of water could drown a field. In such cases, fairness required something more than strict repayment. Laws could recognize disaster as beyond human control, cancelling rent or dividing liability when nature destroyed the harvest. These ideas were not late inventions. They reflect a long tradition in which farming risk was understood as shared, and contracts often included ways out when the season turned against everyone. Even in ordinary years, repayment was not simple arithmetic. Grain prices do not stay still. As the pre-harvest months tighten supplies, the value of grain rises. After harvest, when granaries refill, the value falls again. From a commercial point of view, charging something extra for a loan made sense. Yet for poorer households, any interest extracted in grain meant something painful. Every measure borrowed before harvest could cost more than one measure after harvest, cutting into the next year's security. Different kinds of loans existed side by side. Some carried interest, others did not, and some were framed as favours rather than business. That variety hints at social rules that are not always written down. Relationships mattered, status mattered. The same act of lending could be charity, investment, or control, depending on who was involved and what the borrower was forced to promise in return. Small temples could also function like local financial hubs. Grain might be stored in more than one place across the countryside and issued out on terms that were attractive enough to draw private clients. That kind of lending created a network of dependence that did not always look like domination, but it could still shape behaviour. A household that owed grain might have to give up labour at the worst possible time. That loss of labour could reduce the household's own harvest, which then increased the chance of further borrowing. Debt can become a downward spiral, not because people are careless, but because the structure of repayment drains the very capacity needed to recover. Beyond barley and wheat, the countryside supported a wide range of crops, but the historical record is uneven. Plants appear most clearly when they enter contracts, tax lists, or institutional accounts. Many species are known by name, yet only a smaller group can be tracked with confidence through practical records. Pulses such as lentils and related peas or beans were important. So were onions and garlic. Flax mattered for fibre, and possibly for oil, and oil crops became increasingly significant as urban diets and industries expanded. Some crops followed the same winter cycle as cereals. Pulses and flax could be sown and tended alongside barley and wheat. Onions often fit into the calendar in a clever way, planted after cereal sowing and harvested earlier, creating productive work at a time when cereal fields were still growing. It is a pattern that turns the agricultural year into a chain of overlapping tasks rather than a single crop story. Gardens and orchards added another layer. Cucumbers, lettuces, and root vegetables appear, as do fruit trees such as pomegranates, apples, figs, and vines. Land could be used in stacked ways: tall palms above, smaller fruit trees below, and vegetables beneath that. Such layered planting is efficient in a hot environment, and it turns a grove into a miniature ecosystem managed by human hands. Timber was also part of the landscape. Tamarisk, poplar, and willow could be exploited methodically, especially where water made growth reliable. Certain woods were valued for construction and boat making, and texts suggest deliberate cultivation rather than random gathering. Yet identifying specific tree species from ancient terms is often uncertain. Names travel across languages and centuries, sometimes shifting from one plant to another as habits change. Confident identifications require multiple lines of evidence, and even then, best estimates remain just that. One crop tells a larger story about trade, diet, and historical detection: sesame. Ancient texts describe a major source of culinary oil, and the word used for it is clearly related to the later term that survives in many languages. For a time, scholars doubted whether the crop was truly sesame, largely because seeds were not being found in early archaeological samples. Alternative explanations were proposed, but the agricultural calendar preserved in documents points strongly toward a summer-planted, autumn-harvested oilseed, matching sesame far better than flax, which belongs to the winter season. The absence in excavated remains likely has more to do with preservation, recovery methods, and what people did to the seeds after harvest, than with whether the crop existed. The timing of sesame helps explain its success. It grows through the hottest months, when cereal fields are largely waiting rather than demanding constant work. That summer season turns what could be an off-season into productive labour. Millet may have shared a similar advantage, where the sesame rotated directly onto cereal land after harvest is harder to prove. But the broader system did include fallowing. Leaving land unused every other year helps restore fertility, supports grazing and natural regrowth, and limits the salt buildup that constant irrigation can cause. Ancient texts say surprisingly little about manuring, likely because it was a local practice not closely monitored by official scribes. Crop rotation with legumes to restore soil nitrogen, so familiar in other farming traditions, does not clearly appear and may not have been common in this region. From crops, the story naturally moves to water, because in southern Mesopotamia, water was the true boundary between life and barren ground. The rivers created green corridors through otherwise harsh landscapes. Their channels could shift, branches could split and rejoin, flood patterns could change. Yet across long stretches of time, the basic reality remained stable. Without irrigation, settled agriculture could not survive on the alluvial plain. The first settlements likely hugged the riverbanks, taking advantage of easy access. Over time, growth made that narrow strip too crowded. Moving far upstream or downstream brought conflict with neighbours and stretched travel distances. The practical solution was sideways expansion, pulling water away from the main channel into secondary courses. This could happen through many small branches taken off at multiple points, or through larger channels cut upstream that ran roughly parallel, creating new bands of cultivable land. Early on, local networks probably dominated. Later, larger and more stable channels appear, suggesting a shift toward consolidation. Not all rivers are equally easy to manage. The Euphrates, slower and often easier to control, offered advantages in this environment. It also tended to branch after entering the plain, creating multiple usable routes for water. Soil carried by one river could even be more nutrient-rich than another, affecting productivity under comparable conditions. Such differences mattered to farmers who lived by small margins. A river does not simply lie in a flat plain. As it drops silt, it builds slightly raised ground along its banks, a natural ridge that can be hard to see until water reveals it. This subtle relief is important. Land that slopes even gently can drain better, reducing standing water and limiting salt damage. The coarser silt near the bank can be more fertile and more permeable than the finer deposits farther away. Wells near the river can also tap fresher water because the river influences the local water table. A farmer who understands these details can arrange the landscape intelligently. Gardens and orchards closer to water, cereal fields farther out, with the most delicate crops placed where access is constant. Irrigation, then, is not only about getting water, it is about controlling it. Four concerns dominate the farmer's problem. Water must be brought to the land. It must be held where it is needed. It must be drained when it is no longer wanted. And it must be kept out when it arrives in destructive excess. In practice, a good irrigation regime is a balancing act between supply and safety. For small gardens, water can be lifted by hand from wells or streams. For cereal fields, the most efficient approach is to let gravity do the work. Channels lead water toward the fields, and the flow is guided through openings in canal banks into smaller distributaries. But one key element is needed to make this system reliable. Control structures that raise or block the stream so water can enter the channels at the right level. Temporary barriers can be built from reeds, but long-term management benefits from durable installations. Strong baked brick and waterproof bitumen were used in major hydraulic works, creating permanent regulators that turned a shifting river system into something a farmer could depend on. Unlike river systems that peak when crops need water most, Mesopotamia faced a frustrating mismatch. The greatest need often came in autumn and winter, during soil preparation and early crop growth, yet river levels were lowest then. Water rose later, in spring, just as cereals approached maturity and required less irrigation. That mismatch forced efficiency. Water access became a right worth defining carefully, even inside families. When property was divided, water claims had to be specified alongside land itself. Rotation of irrigation was one practical solution. Cereal fields did not need daily watering, and periodic irrigation spaced through the growing season could be enough. But a rota requires organisation. Someone must coordinate turn-taking, inspect channels, and enforce maintenance. Canals also demanded seasonal labour after harvest. Reeds could clog slow-flowing sections. Silt could build up in the bed. Clearing it meant digging and throwing spoil onto the banks, gradually raising tall embankments along the canal. These banks show, even today, how much human labour is stored in the landscape. Administrative thinking followed the same logic. If canal cleaning required a known stretch to be cleared to a known depth, then labour could be calculated, rations could be assigned, and the work could be planned like any other large rural operation. Large irrigation works were never all the same. Some jobs could be handled with local effort and routine planning, while others demanded cooperation on a scale that only strong political coordination could sustain. The difference matters because water management was not simply a technical issue. It shaped how communities worked together, how authority was justified, and how agriculture survived during stable periods and suffered when order collapsed. Routine records from big institutions frequently note that canals were cleared, inspected, and treated as fixed features of the landscape. Far less often do those records describe carving entirely new canals into the plain. That absence makes sense when the labour is imagined in practical terms. Even a modest new canal, only a few metres across, required digging a long trench, throwing spoil up into banks, stabilizing the edges, and building a control point that could raise or regulate flow. Such work was expensive in manpower and time. It also created disputes unless it was agreed upon. A channel that pulls water toward one community can reduce supply for another. That is why a small canal was still a collective venture, typically requiring several villages to cooperate from the start. When the project grew larger, it gained a public meaning. Building a major control structure was the kind of accomplishment leaders wanted remembered. It was not merely a repair job. It was a statement that the land could be organized, and that water could be compelled to serve human goals. At the very largest scale, when rulers claimed they redirected great rivers or created new lifelines across wide regions, the engineering was only one part of the story. Such schemes assumed political reach across multiple districts. The moment irrigation crossed the boundaries of local interests, it depended on the ability to make communities accept a common plan, even when the benefits and costs were unevenly distributed. That dependence on wide area coordination had consequences. When political unity held, large-scale agriculture could expand, and the system could absorb shocks. When the political order fractured, those shared projects became fragile. A canal that needed many hands and many agreements could not be sustained if the agreements failed. The fields downstream would feel the break long before any official document recorded it. Construction was only the first challenge. Maintenance demanded as much discipline as digging. Rivers and canals carry silt, and silt accumulates. Channels grow shallow. Flow slows. Banks crumble. Water levels drop before reaching the tail end of the system. If too many outlets are cut into a canal, the level sinks everywhere, and the last fields receive little. Keeping a system functional required continual clearance and rules about who could draw water and how much. That kind of coordination likely belonged to local administration in villages and districts, rather than to the central state. The state had interests in harvest and revenue, but it often did not need to micromanage every local rotation schedule if local officials could handle the routine. This is an important detail because it suggests that political power and irrigation management were related, but not always in the simple way people imagine, as if the whole system must automatically be centralized. Once water was available, farmers also needed a way to hold it where it mattered. Fields could be flooded early in the season to soften soil and prepare the ground. Later, as crops grew, low banks around plots helped keep water in furrows long enough to soak in rather than running off immediately. In addition to these field banks, there is evidence that some communities built long, narrow basins alongside canals. These were not tiny pits. Some were substantial cuts, dug with clear intent and repeated effort. The purpose of these basins is not perfectly obvious. The simplest explanation is that they acted as small reservoirs, collecting water for later use. Yet their sizes varied dramatically from one region to another, and even the larger examples, when imagined against the needs of broad cereal fields, do not look capable of transforming the whole grain regime by themselves. The climate adds another difficulty. Water stored in open basins in southern heat evaporates quickly, limiting its usefulness for long-term seasonal storage. A more plausible role is that such basins supported high-value crops that could not tolerate the long gaps between scheduled irrigations. Cereals can survive with a few well-timed waterings. Vegetables and garden plants are less forgiving, especially in heat and wind. If a community could store water near gardens, even briefly, it would reduce the need for constant lifting by hand. That matters because lifting water is slow, exhausting work. In some places, it appears that those tasked with water lifting were people whose labour could be controlled and assigned in ways that reflect the social hierarchy of the time. Whatever the exact function, these basins represent investment. People kept digging them and maintaining them, which strongly suggests they delivered value, even if their value was local rather than system-wide. If controlling supply and storage was hard, removing water could be just as challenging. In the winter, southern Mesopotamia can become a place of stubborn wetness. The land lies only slightly above sea level across great distances, and the terrain is not a clean slope. It is a patchwork shaped by old canal lines, raised banks, abandoned channels, and shallow basins. Water that enters such a landscape can linger. If excess irrigation water is not drained away, the groundwater rises, and with it comes salt. Salt moves upward through the soil as moisture evaporates, and over time it can poison fields. When the sun dries the surface, salt can appear as a pale crust, bright enough to resemble frost. People recognized the danger. The whiteness of fields became a natural image for disaster and hunger. Land surveys and descriptions distinguish plots by quality and include areas affected by salt. Later scholars argued that a long-term rise in salinity reshaped agriculture, encouraging barley over wheat and contributing to broader shifts in settlement patterns. Whether that explanation fits every region and every period is debated. What does not require debate is the local reality. Some fields became salty and farmers had to respond. Part of the response was the fallow system. Leaving land uncultivated for a season helps recovery and limits some of the damage caused by constant irrigation and evaporation. Yet fallow alone does not solve drainage. The crucial question is how farmers manage to get unwanted water off their land, and the record is frustratingly quiet on the details. It is possible that the practical methods were so routine and local that they did not attract administrative attention, even though they were essential for long-term farming. Another threat came from too much water arriving at the wrong time. Flooding was not rare. Rivers rise seasonally, and their channels in raised levees can stand higher than the surrounding plain. When a river breaks free, water can spread across vast expanses because the land is so flat. Natural rivers tend to meander, and traces of ancient meanders can still be detected. But meanders are inconvenient for agriculture. They eat land in one place and deposit it in another. Farmers and administrators preferred straighter, confined channels, even though land sales and boundary agreements still had to account for the river's ability to bite into a plot or build new ground beside it. When floods approached, there were practical emergency measures. Control structures could be opened to reduce pressure. Sluices and weak points had to be watched. A single failure could drown fields and settlements. Flood control was not just a matter of nature. Human negligence could also cause disaster. If one farmer mismanaged an outlet or let water escape uncontrolled, it could wash away a neighbour's carefully prepared furrows and uproot young plants. Because such damage was predictable, legal rules insisted on compensation. These were not abstract principles. They were community safeguards designed to keep disputes from tearing the countryside apart. Earthworks were the everyday defence. Banks formed naturally along canals as silt was cleared and piled on the edges. Additional dikes enclosed fields held water in place during soaking and kept it out where it did not belong. Some were small and local. Others were massive, defining whole management zones. At the extreme end were border dikes that separated territories and symbolized political boundaries as much as they managed water. Large-scale dike building could even reclaim land from marshes, turning wet margins into usable plots through sustained labour and planning. All of this water management connects directly to land ownership and social power. Land was the core resource, yet the surviving evidence does not give a simple picture. Administrative records show what institutions cared about and what law tried to regulate. They do not capture every private arrangement, informal exchange, or local tradition. There is also a constant tension between legal ideals and lived reality. Laws persist even as people bend practices to fit new conditions. Over centuries, land systems become layered. Old forms do not vanish. They fade, overlap, and survive in altered roles. Private ownership certainly existed, but its visibility changes with the record. In some periods, sales of fields are rare, which has led to arguments that land was absorbed by the state. That conclusion is not necessary. Another explanation is that sales were socially discouraged, treated as a last resort, or restricted by family expectations. Fields could be tied to kin groups rather than individuals, making full alienation difficult, even if not explicitly illegal. In some societies, even when sales were forbidden, transfers still happened through legal fictions that preserved the appearance of the rule while achieving the practical outcome. The absence of sale documents may reflect how people behaved, not just what governments demanded. Family structure mattered. Inheritance texts sometimes separate land from other property, hinting that fields were handled by different rules. In some places, kin groups rented fields together, sharing risk and labour. At the same time, there is evidence in certain cities of individuals and special social categories accumulating large holdings as business ventures. The challenge is to know how typical those cases were, and whether they represent wide patterns or local exceptions. Debt adds another layer. A poor harvest year can force borrowing. Borrowing can lead to pledging land. Pledging can end in sale. Sale can turn former owners into tenants on the same soil they once called theirs. That cycle is documented more clearly in some later contexts than in early Mesopotamia, but the logic is familiar. It is also consistent with the way harvest time labour obligations could be used as leverage. A borrower who owes days of work to a creditor loses the ability to harvest at the best moment. That loss reduces yield, which increases the need to borrow again. The mechanism is simple and brutal. It turns time into a weapon. Land prices, when they appear, can seem low. One reason is economic logic. Money could yield profit through lending, so land was not valued at limitless multiples of annual produce. But there are other factors that documents may not record. Land can carry obligations. Land can lack reliable water access. Payments may have been made informally, beyond what the contract states. Some sales may also have been vulnerable to later political resets, such as debt cancellations, which could reduce the long-term security of purchasing land from a distressed seller. Because field sales were not always common, leasing became crucial. Leasing balanced labour and land. A landowner might lease out plots because the household lacked the hands to cultivate everything. A landless or newly arrived farmer might lease because a subsistence plot was necessary. Rental terms often followed local norms. Payment could be a share of the crop, a fixed amount, or an agreed rate, comparable to neighbouring fields. Tenants could also owe contributions to communal canal maintenance. When a tenant took on uncultivated land, contracts could be more generous at first, reflecting the extra work of bringing it into production. Similar arrangements existed for planting orchards, where years of labour were required before profit appeared. Harvest remained the defining moment. Labour shortages made it a battlefield of advantage. Wealthier owners could secure harvesting crews through credit arrangements, pulling workers into their fields exactly when timing mattered most. On the threshing floors, the year's drama became measurable. Grain was divided according to contract, often favouring the tenant more than the landlord. yet still leaving the tenant vulnerable to risk and to the hidden costs of debt, tools, animals, and seed. Where rent was paid as a share of harvest, there was an obvious temptation to underreport yield. Storm and flood could be real, but excuses could also be convenient. Systems developed to discourage fraud, sometimes involving solemn guarantees tied to sacred authority. The point was not theology for its own sake. It was an enforcement mechanism in a world where precise surveillance was impossible. Alongside private land and private leases stood the vast estates of temples and palaces. These institutions held land in multiple categories. Some was cultivated directly for the institution, using its own labour. Some was assigned to officials and workers as part of their compensation. Some excess land was rented out to outsiders. This system did two things at once. It kept the institution fed and supplied. It also pushed part of the institution's wealth back into society through allocations and employment, binding households to institutional rhythms. Land assigned as compensation often could not be sold in the usual way, because it was tied to service. Yet practical life still created flexibility. If an official lacked enough labour to work the whole holding, it could be leased to someone else, often under terms similar to ordinary rentals. Over time, such assigned land could start to behave like inherited property in practice, especially if offices themselves tended to stay within families. Another important category linked land to military obligation. The state's goal was recruits, so the duty could pass to sons, allowing families to inherit the right to land along with the responsibility attached to it. Authorities worried about avoidance strategies, and correspondence from rulers shows repeated disputes over who deserved land, who had been wronged, and who had manipulated assignments. All of this helps explain why institutions enjoyed structural advantages over small farmers. Large-scale irrigation and cultivation are more efficient when coordinated across big units. Waterworks are easier to build and maintain when one authority can plan for a whole zone. Ploughing with ox teams favours long furrows and field layouts that reduce turning. Long narrow strips also maximise canal access for many plots. Such patterns can arise by village agreement, but they are easier to enforce and administer inside a single large enterprise. Scale also improves the use of equipment and labour. A large estate can share animals and tools across multiple tasks and fields. It can invest in improved technology and benefit from it repeatedly. It can allocate labour where it is most needed, shift workers between crops, and plan schedules that smooth bottlenecks. When conditions turn bad, a large organisation can move cultivation into different ecological pockets, diversify crops, or shift attention to more profitable products. A small farmer tied to one plot has far fewer options. If salinity rises or water supply fails, the household cannot simply relocate. Often, the only choices are to plant more densely or to violate fallow, both of which can speed the decline of the soil. Capital also changes what risks are tolerable. Institutions can invest in reclaiming marginal land at the edges of irrigated cells. They can accept occasional failures because the good years pay for the bad. In northern zones where rainfall farming borders on uncertainty, the same logic applies. Large holders can gamble across wide belts of land, while a single household may not survive one total loss. None of this means village collaboration was weak. Villages clearly had the capacity for coordinated action, at least in water allocation and local maintenance. They likely coordinate fallow placement too, because grouping fallow fields can be practical. Extended families could also farm jointly and gain some efficiencies by avoiding rigid division into tiny plots. But even strong village cooperation had limits. It could not easily match the scale of massive canal projects, or cope with major environmental shifts, such as the drying of a major channel that had once sustained whole districts. The overall picture is a landscape where water, land, labour, and power are inseparable. Irrigation demanded cooperation, but it also created leverage. Land could feed families, yet it could also become collateral that pulled them into dependency. Institutions could bring stability and innovation, but they could also widen inequality by capturing labour at the most critical moment of the year. In the end, the same system that produced surplus and urban wealth also produced vulnerability for those who lived closest to the soil. Clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia often look, at first glance, like paperwork without a story. Lines of numbers, lists of goods, names, dates, and destinations. Yet behind that accounting lies a simple reality. Cities and countryside depended on one another. Food, raw materials, and crafted objects had to move. Without reliable ways to shift those goods from where they were produced to where they were consumed, urban life could not function at scale. Early societies handled exchange in more than one way, and Mesopotamia is a classic place to see those systems overlapping. One style of exchange is rooted in relationships. A household gives something to another household not as a spot transaction, but as part of an understood bond. The return does not have to come immediately. It can arrive later, in another form, at another moment of need. The point is not a calculated price, but a durable tie that carries obligations in both directions. Over time, that kind of relationship can become predictable and almost formal, even if it is never written down. For work crews, offerings, gifts, and for work crews, offerings, gifts, and support for dependents. That system helped free part of the population from farming so they could become administrators, builders, craft specialists, or soldiers. It could strengthen state power and concentrate resources, but it was not the only path that led to complex society. It was simply one powerful method that worked well in a landscape where production and water control demanded coordination. A third style resembles what modern people call a market. Goods can pass between strangers. Prices can rise and fall. Supply and demand can shape what is worth producing and what is worth transporting. Mesopotamia certainly had merchants and long-distance traders, and it had places and moments where bargaining and price mattered. But it is risky to assume that market forces governed everything. A society can contain markets while still relying heavily on personal obligation and institutional redistribution. One of the most revealing features of Mesopotamian life is that these different logics coexisted, sometimes in harmony and sometimes in tension. That mixed system shaped daily living. Temples might accumulate remarkable treasures, but most households did not resemble vaults packed with luxury. The ordinary family's property was more practical. Textiles, furniture, tools, animals, perhaps a servant or two in wealthier cases. A bride's household goods could be impressive, yet even then the list is telling. It is full of clothing, containers, livestock, and items that keep a household running. Wealth existed, but it often sat in movable, usable forms rather than in piles of precious metal. The everyday diet also reveals a world built on staples. Grain and oil mattered most. Wool mattered as clothing and as a store of value. Salt, bitumen, and basic metals had recognized worth. Alongside these were vegetables, fruit, occasional meat, and the spices that gave Near Eastern cooking its reputation. Some aromatics were imported and expensive, especially resins and fragrant substances that served ritual and elite tastes. The ordinary household might encounter those occasionally, but institutions and palaces consumed them on a different scale. How did a family actually buy and sell what it needed? The evidence is suggestive but incomplete. There are hints of small shops, streets associated with buying, mobile sellers, and city gates connected with exchange. All of that points toward a modest, private retail world, serving daily needs. But its size is hard to measure. It is not obvious whether most private surplus was mainly shared through kin and neighbourhood networks, or routinely handed over to commercial middlemen. The existence of intermediaries is clear, and the city likely saw more commercial behaviour than the countryside. Yet, the balance between these spheres remains difficult to pin down. Whenever harvests failed or costs rose, borrowing became unavoidable. A household with no surplus had to bridge the lean months. In many cases, credit came from other private citizens, not from temples or palaces, even though institutions sometimes acted as lenders too. Interest was not a rare or exotic feature, it was built into the system. Silver loans and grain loans carried expected returns, and those returns could be heavy. A loan of grain taken before harvest could cost more than grain after harvest, simply because the borrower was repaying at the moment, when grain was abundant, and values had shifted, while also adding an extra portion as interest. To protect lenders, borrowers often handed over a pledge. Sometimes the pledge was an object, a tool, a garment, an animal, a metal item kept until repayment arrived. But the most alarming pledges were people or land. A son could be placed in the lender's hands as security. Land could be tied up until the debt was cleared. These arrangements reveal more than financial practice. They show vulnerability. Losing access to labour within the family, or losing control of a field, made it harder to recover from the crisis that caused the loan in the first place. Political disruption made those pressures worse. In the southern plain, famine often followed violence, blockade, or breakdown in the management of irrigation and transport. A besieged city could starve behind walls. Grain could become scarce not because nature failed, but because order failed. When scarcity and debt combined, the gap between rich and poor widened. Landowners and large organizations could absorb risk, shift resources, and wait out trouble. Smaller households had fewer options. The grim end of the spiral is easy to imagine. A family sells land, then sells labor, and finally sinks into dependency while still living on the same soil. Now as tenants rather than owners. Mesopotamian rulers claimed a moral role in resisting exploitation. Royal ideology repeatedly frames kingship as protection for the vulnerable, promising that the strong should not crush the weak. That ideal appears not only in courtroom language, but also in public concern for living costs. Price lists and official rates for wages and rentals were presented as signs of good rule. It is uncertain how well such claims worked in practice, since real transactions often show higher figures. But the political message matters. The population expected the ruler to care about economic hardship, not only about war and monuments. More than price talk, there was a policy that could reshape lives in a concrete way. Periodic cancellation of certain debts. These edicts were not random generosity. They were interventions meant to prevent the credit system from turning too many households into permanent dependence. The language of freedom and returning home captures the human side of it. People who had been trapped by debt could be released. Families could be restored. In some cases, the measures seem to have reached across political boundaries, implying that credit ties could extend beyond a single city's control. In later periods, these cancellations did more than free pledged persons. They could also overturn certain financial obligations and transactions that had been forced distress. Creditors complained. Disputes erupted. Yet the edicts did not erase all obligations equally. They tended to protect normal commercial investment from being destroyed. Partnerships, business ventures, and arrangements that looked like trade finance could be excluded. The goal was to undo coercion and desperation, not to sabotage the mechanisms that kept long-distance procurement and professional commerce alive. One of the clearest windows into that mixed world is the relationship between palace and merchants. In some cities, officials and merchants were tied together through systems that resemble a controlled form of outsourcing. The palace gathered large quantities of staple goods. It needed silver for certain purposes, and it wanted to shift surplus without paying the full cost of storage, transport, and distribution. Instead of handling every transaction directly, it transferred goods, or rights to goods, to merchants who could move them into wider circulation. These arrangements could become complicated because they were not always physical handovers on the spot. A tenant might owe grain to the palace as rent. If the tenant fell behind, the palace could assign the claim to a merchant. The merchant would then hold a document acknowledging the tenant's obligation, and another document expressing what the merchant owed the palace in return. In normal times, the merchant would collect from the tenant later. The palace would eventually collect from the merchant. The palace gained by shifting the burden of collection and distribution to a private agent, and by converting claims into silver without doing the legwork itself. But when a royal debt cancellation arrived, the logic changed. A tenant's arrears might be forgiven. That could leave a merchant in an impossible position, owing payment to the palace for a claim that could no longer be collected. To prevent that from becoming unfair, the edict could also cancel the merchant's corresponding obligation, provided the merchant truly had not received the goods or the repayment already. Procedures were created to settle the matter: oaths, receipts, mutual accounting. The aim was not to punish merchants, but to align the cancellation with the reality of what had and had not actually changed hands. Could reduce storage costs, and a void could reduce storage costs and avoid countless small distribution tasks. It could also move the problem of chasing late payments onto merchants whose livelihoods depended on their ability to collect and resell. In effect, the merchant community could act as a bridge between bureaucratic claims and real economic extraction. From the merchant's perspective, the system offered secure access to goods and predictable opportunities. Terms could favour merchants in ways that look startling. Payments might be delayed. The merchant might pay only a portion up front. The nominal value used in accounting might not match street-level bargaining. That raises a key question. How large were the merchant's true profits once transport, spoilage, storage, labour, and risk were included? The surviving documents rarely show the full ledger of costs. What they do show is that palace and merchant were bound in a structured relationship, and that the king and high officials sometimes supervised it closely, especially when large sums were at stake. For a time, without immediate loss. For a time, without immediate loss. In other regions and later decades, the regular palace goods offered to merchants can shift. Wool remains important, sesame oil production can rise, and cattle can appear as a strategic product tied to leather and traction. The palace was not only selling accidental leftovers. In some cases, it appears to have organised production specifically to generate a tradable surplus. One conspicuous absence often stands out: cereals. Palaces certainly collected large quantities of barley and other grains, yet merchant concession systems often emphasise other goods. Why? Several possibilities exist. Grain may have been too essential as a strategic reserve. Grain could also serve as a flexible payment medium in many contexts, making it less attractive as a controlled retail commodity. And in some cases, the palace may have preferred to use grain directly for rations, labour payments, and institutional needs, rather than releasing it into a merchant pipeline. Earlier state systems show a different but related pattern. Merchant accounts from the late 3rd millennium reveal a world where the merchant stands between institutional surplus and imported necessities. On the income side appear staples and standard goods, supplied by the state. On the expense side appear materials and luxuries that the palace could not easily produce itself: timber, resins, aromatics, specialty products, and materials that came from distant ecological zones. In that model, the merchant is not merely a shopkeeper. The merchant becomes a converter, turning local surplus into foreign goods that express status, ritual power, and political prestige. Sometimes the merchant is issued silver directly, which highlights another reality. Silver functioned as a widely accepted value measure. If the palace handed silver to a merchant, it was not trying to sell silver. It was equipping an agent to obtain things the palace wanted. That is where the story naturally turns toward currency and payment systems. When metal and grain can both operate as standard measures, the boundary between trade, taxation, wages, and credit becomes thin. A single society can treat the same commodity as food, as rent, as wage, and as money, depending on context and on who is recording the transaction. In the late 3rd millennium BCE, a merchant's clay account tablet could turn a whole world into a single number. Wool, dates, oil, wood, resins, metals, stones, even odd items like bitumen or gypsum might all appear as separate lines, yet each line was translated into one shared measure: silver by weight. That single measure made the ledger work. Incoming goods were assigned a silver value, and the total became the capital the merchant was responsible for. Outgoing purchases were listed the same way. When the period ended, the scribe could subtract total spending from total capital and record the remainder as one balance, positive or negative, ready to be carried forward into the next cycle of accounting. This method looks almost modern in its logic, but it raises a deeper question. If silver is the language of the balance sheet, does that mean silver was truly money for everyone, everywhere, all the time? Or was silver simply a bookkeeping tool used by merchants and officials, while ordinary people relied on other forms of exchange? To understand the difference, it helps to separate the different roles that money can play. First, a society can use something as a standard of accounting. That means it becomes the unit used to measure value, even if nobody actually hands it over in everyday life. Second, something can be a medium of exchange, meaning it is used to trade for goods and services directly. Third, something can be a means of payment, a straightforward settlement of an obligation. A worker is paid, a debt is repaid, a purchase is completed, and the payment itself closes the matter. These roles often overlap, but they do not have to. A society might measure value in one unit while paying in another. It might use a unit of account, mainly on paper, while relying on barter and obligation in practice. In Mesopotamia, however, silver does not stay confined to the accountant's stylus. The fact that silver can appear inside the merchant's capital alongside other goods suggests it was not just an abstract measuring stick. It could circulate as an exchange item in its own right. And the broader documentary record shows silver functioning as direct payment too. Prices in sale agreements are commonly expressed in silver. Many loans are written in silver terms, and some administrative texts show labour or services being settled with measured amounts of silver. This is not coinage, not minted discs, stamped by a state, but it is metal working as money through weight. In a world without coins, a practical problem remains. How does a community handle small, everyday payments and make them predictable? One solution is to shape the metal into convenient, repeatable forms. Mesopotamian texts sometimes hint at standardized pieces of silver, shaped in ways that made weighing and dividing easier. Archaeology supports this with finds of coiled or spiral silver pieces. These objects are not jewellery in the usual sense. Their shape makes them easy to break and portion, turning a larger piece into smaller weight units as needed. For larger sums, more solid lumps or ingot-like forms could exist, although they survive less often. Most documents do not specify the form of silver being used, because the key feature was weight. The metal's value was anchored in scales and accepted standards rather than in a stamped design. Silver, however, did not rule alone. In the early second millennium, silver was often the preferred value language for merchants and sometimes for administrators. But other commodities could perform money-like roles. Barley could serve as a settlement medium and as a reference point for value in many transactions, especially in contexts tied to agriculture and rations. Other metals such as copper and tin could also function as payment media, often with recognized conversion ratios. In some regions, certain finished metal objects appear as payment tools, axes, cups, and other valuable crafted forms that could be weighed. That creates a blurred boundary between currency and elite gift goods. A metal cup has worth as metal, worth as craft, and worth as a symbol. In places farther from the dense commercial hubs of the southern alluvium, these symbolic and crafted payment forms seem to appear more frequently, suggesting that the money of a society can change depending on local habits, distance from markets, and the social meaning attached to objects. Once silver and other payment media are in view, the story naturally widens into foreign trade. Trade is one of the easiest social processes to detect in archaeology, because imported metals and stones survive well. The southern plain of Mesopotamia had to import many raw materials. Precious stones, hard woods, and metal ores do not originate in the flat riverlands in the quantities needed by cities. These materials had to come from elsewhere. Some can be traced to their geological sources through scientific analysis. But even when sources can be identified, reconstructing the human roots and agreements behind that movement is far more difficult. Recent archaeology has added a crucial dimension. It is not only the consumer cities that matter, but also distant production zones and workshop sites that were part of the same network. Copper sources in southeastern Arabia, stoneworking industries in Iran, and long-distance bead and seal traditions connected to the Indus world all show that the trade system was not a single line, but a web. Often, the most important goods moved as processed raw materials, rather than finished products. Copper might arrive as refined metal, rather than ore. Stones might arrive partly shaped, and beads might arrive as blanks, ready for final finishing. Occasionally, a foreign-made item appears in Mesopotamian contexts, so distinctively that its workshop tradition is unmistakable, like seals in an external style. The documents of trade also leave physical traces. Seals, seal impressions on clay, and standardized weights can show that commercial procedures existed even when the goods themselves were perishable and vanish from the archaeological record. In some cases, those administrative artifacts are the only surviving evidence that exchange happened at all. It is misleading, however, to speak of trade as a single system with a single social impact. Different categories of goods behaved differently. Luxury goods served a small elite market. Rare stones, fine aromatics, prestige objects. Staple trade served more specific sectors. Textiles for export, metals for tool production, oils and wool for institutional needs, goods that could be stored and moved as wealth. Essentials, on the other hand, touched almost everyone. Salt, grinding stones, basic tools, materials needed for daily work. Long-standing exchange arrangements for essentials likely laid the groundwork for larger and more ambitious ventures. Archaeology, less biased, toward the high-status items celebrated in texts, can bring those everyday essentials back into focus. Some of the earliest long-distance exchange in the region can be glimpsed through obsidian, the volcanic glass valued for sharp cutting edges. Obsidian sources were limited, and pieces travelled widely long before the Age of Empires. That distribution hints at repeated contacts across large distances, even when the social form of exchange remains unclear. Later, the appearance of large caches of grinding stones at certain sites suggests specialized production and distribution, implying that even heavy, bulky essentials could move in organized ways when a region had an advantage in raw material and workmanship. Then comes a striking shift: the late 4th millennium expansion of southern Mesopotamian cultural materials across a wide arc. Fine ceramics, early administrative clay tokens and ceilings, and settlement patterns appear far from the southern heartland, sometimes as if whole pieces of a southern city were transplanted intact. In some places, the southern presence looks like an overlay on local society. In others, it resembles a purpose-built colony positioned on a strategic river route. The most persuasive reason for such settlements is control of movement and exchange along waterways that linked interior regions to the southern plain. Yet even here, caution is essential. It is easy to invent a neat story about what goods went out and what goods came back. But later, evidence warns that reasonable guesses can be wrong, because human initiative in trade can be opportunistic, changing rapidly, and often invisible in the archaeological record. Certain materials do provide firmer anchors. Lapis lazuli, for example, ultimately comes from far to the east. Its presence in Western sites proves that eastward routes existed, even when the carriers and intermediaries remain uncertain. Archaeology in the Iranian plateau and beyond reveals caravan cities and workshop centres, where stones were trimmed and prepared for export. The raw materials were not simply gathered and shipped, they were processed according to specialised routines, with different stones receiving different treatment. That suggests not occasional wandering traders, but repeated professional handling and an accumulated knowledge of what distant buyers wanted. Across the plateau, political geography shifted, and trade likely moved through multiple corridors rather than one fixed highway. Different industrial sites rose and fell. Some produced carved stone vessels, others specialized in beads, still others served as staging points for movement toward Mesopotamia. Along the Gulf, sea trade adds another layer. Mesopotamian pottery along coastal sites and evidence of ports suggests maritime links already existed early on, and those links could move heavier cargoes more efficiently than donkey caravans, especially when bulk metal was involved. Even when early written records are sparse, trade entered cultural memory. Stories describe rulers seeking precious materials from distant lands beyond mountain ranges, sending messengers and exchanging large quantities of grain for exotic stones and craftsmanship. Whether the stories reflect specific events or symbolic ideals, they preserve a sense that long-distance exchange could be substantial, organized, and tied to both prestige and temple building. As written records become more abundant, traders themselves start to appear more clearly. Early administrative documents often distinguish between local merchants and specialists dealing in foreign goods. That distinction hints at different social roles. One group moving commodities within the land, another handling cross-border or long-distance circuits. A dramatic example of organized long-distance commerce emerges in central Anatolia in the early 2nd millennium. Thousands of tablets found in merchant quarters show that a community from northern Mesopotamia built a sustained trading presence far from home. The trade had a clear structure. Merchant houses organized caravans exporting tin and textiles. the caravans travelled across plains and mountain passes, reaching trading districts established within major Anatolian cities. There, goods were exchanged for silver and gold, which then travelled back to the home city. The venture ran for generations, revealing a level of planning and continuity that cannot be dismissed as occasional adventure. Tin was crucial because it allowed bronze production when alloyed with copper. Anatolia had its own resources, but the steady flow of imported tin suggests that external supply chains were reliable, competitive, or better controlled. Textiles formed the second great pillar of the trade. Not all textiles were equal. Letters reveal concerns about quality and availability, implying a recognized hierarchy of cloth and a strong demand for the best products. Caravans were balanced for transport realities. Tin could be packed in standardized loads, while textiles, though bulky, were valuable enough to justify space. A donkey could not carry unlimited weight, so merchants optimized what went on its sides and how much could be carried per animal. The tablets also reveal how business was financed and controlled. Partnerships formed to raise large capital sums. Debts were tracked at both ends of the route. Family matters and inheritance could become commercial concerns when assets were tied up in trade. The trading community abroad acted like a miniature institution. It had officials, it enforced rules, and it mediated disputes among its members. Taxes were collected on consignments, and further dues were taken upon arrival. These funds supported the trading district's administration and helped maintain relations with local rulers. Smuggling existed as temptation and risk. The documents mention surveillance, enforcement, and the danger of arrest. Certain goods were restricted and some luxuries were treated as monopolies, reserved for specific authorities back home. Trade was not a free-for-all. It was a negotiated space between merchants, home institutions, and foreign rulers. Over time, the system changed. Political disruptions in the merchant's homeland could loosen older controls. New offices appear that suggest tighter oversight by royal authorities in some phases, while merchant self-governance seems weaker in others. The trade eventually fades, and its end is difficult to attribute to a single cause. Changes within Anatolia, the rise of new powers, and shifting political landscapes in Mesopotamia and Syria all could have reshaped the routes and incentives. One of the most unsettling lessons from this episode is archaeological. Without the tablets, excavators might never have guessed that they were digging the houses of a foreign merchant community. The merchants did not necessarily import distinctive pottery or architecture. They brought values, procedures, and goods that often vanish. Tin leaves, little trace once melted into bronze. Textiles decay. The trade's material footprint could be minimal. The writing tradition vanished with the colony, leaving little visible continuity. This is a warning. Absence of evidence in the ground is not evidence that the trade never existed. At the southern end of Mesopotamia, the picture flips. Here, the home archives exist, but the far end of the sea venture is harder to see directly in texts. Merchant families in a major southern city organized maritime trade, down the Gulf to island ports and beyond. Imports included luxury goods and, critically, copper in large quantities. Archaeology now makes it plausible that much of this copper came from the mountains of southeastern Arabia. Farther east, connections to the Indus world appear through distinctive beads, seals, and weights found along the Gulf and inside Mesopotamia. These are not vague similarities. They show contact across great distances, involving goods whose origins lay far from the river plain. Exports from Mesopotamia in these seaborne circuits were often manufactured goods and perishables, textiles, wool, leather, oil, and grain. These rarely survive archaeologically, but the documents suggest that outbound cargo was substantial and organized. Some texts list valuable exotic items brought back: stones, shells, ivory, rare woods, pearls, and finished objects. There are also hints that in earlier times Mesopotamian ships may have reached farther, while later they stopped at nearer ports. That shift can reflect power changes in the Gulf, with intermediary communities controlling access. It can also reflect economic changes at home, with private ventures replacing state-funded expeditions, leading to smaller ships and less capital-intensive journeys. Sea trade was spectacular, but it was not the only artery. River transport moved goods along the great waterways, enriching cities positioned on key stretches. Overland trade continued beyond one famous merchant colony. Nomadic and semi-nomadic groups could participate in exchange and sometimes in slave trading, prompting royal orders aimed at limiting illicit purchases. Different cities developed reputations for particular goods. Specialty items could be sought in specific places, suggesting that regional markets existed even without a single unified market economy. Merchants appear repeatedly as the connective tissue of this system. The same person who moved goods domestically could also participate in foreign circuits. Merchant associations emerge as recognizable bodies, sometimes operating like guilds with officers and collective responsibilities. In some cities, these associations acted as legal authorities and as administrative arms, enforcing rules, managing disputes, and even implementing royal directives. The merchant body could be officially recognized, yet retain a degree of autonomy. That combination makes sense. Trade requires trust and flexibility. A merchant must travel beyond direct supervision, whether crossing deserts, sailing coasts, or moving through foreign territories. Goods are entrusted to the merchant, and responsibility follows. The relationship between merchant and palace can look like employment, agency, partnership, or all at once depending on the transaction and the period. There are strong reasons foreign trade is often best handled by merchants, rather than by the direct hand of the state. Caravans passing through foreign lands benefit from neutrality. Merchants who are not seen as an invading power can negotiate passage and protection more easily. History repeatedly shows trade before conquest, with commercial networks reaching farther than armies. That logic makes long-distance ventures plausible, even in periods when political control did not extend across the route. Inside Mesopotamia, merchants also provided advantages to palaces and temples. Institutions could produce or collect surpluses and then hand off distribution and procurement tasks to merchant specialists. Sometimes, the institution provided silver or copper not to be dumped into a market, but to fund a mission to acquire goods not available locally. In those cases, the merchant acts as a commissioned buyer, converting institutional capital into imported necessities and luxuries. When large empires collapsed, the balance of initiative could shift. Bureaucratic machinery can fail quickly, but demand for redistribution and foreign goods does not vanish overnight. Merchant groups, already experienced and connected, can step into the gap, continuing earlier activities under new leadership and with new arrangements. In some cities, merchant associations emerge as organizers and negotiators, dealing with palaces as collective bodies rather than as isolated individuals. Officers coordinate relations between merchants and rulers, assign concessions, and handle disputes. Local governments can even use merchant institutions to perform tasks once managed internally, because the merchant body has personnel, procedures, and the ability to act quickly. Seen from a distance, the economic world that emerges is neither purely market nor purely command economy. It is a layered system. Silver can be an accounting unit and also a real payment medium. Barley can act like money in certain contexts. Finished metal objects can drift between currency and prestige gifts. Trade can be organized by private families, yet regulated by institutions and foreign rulers. Some routes move bulk staples, others move high-value luxuries. And the evidence itself is uneven. Texts spotlight certain transactions, archaeology preserves others, and the real system sits somewhere between what survives on clay and what survives in the ground. That is why Mesopotamian trade and money remain so compelling. They force attention to the gap between value on paper and value in life. A single line of silver weight on a tablet can conceal wool bundles, fish loads, bead workshops, caravan taxes, seaports, and the risks of desert roads. The account may end with one balance carried forward, but the human world behind it never stands still. The rise of the first cities did not simply bring more people together in one place. It changed how work itself was organized. As populations grew and settlements expanded, societies began dividing responsibilities among their members. Some people produced food, others crafted tools, some managed records and administration, others organized labor or commanded soldiers. This division of roles created specialization, one of the defining features of early urban life. Specialization took different forms. In some cases, people focused on particular skills such as farming techniques, pottery making, metalworking, or textile production. This type of division spread activity across society, allowing individuals to develop expertise in specific crafts. At the same time, specialization also created layers of authority. Administrative roles emerged, and systems of command developed. This produced a vertical structure of organization, forming the foundations of bureaucratic government. Early written records reveal how deeply this process had already shaped society. Lists of occupations show a wide range of crafts and professions, demonstrating that both technical and administrative specialization had advanced considerably. These activities were often connected to large institutions, such as temples and royal households. Such institutions benefited from controlling specialized work, but they also create the conditions that allowed knowledge and technical skill to develop. By organizing labor, gathering resources, and supporting skilled workers, they helped new technologies spread more rapidly. In many ways, technological change transformed daily life most profoundly in agriculture. Farming required tools, and even simple implements show how innovation unfolded over time. Early harvesting tools consisted of stone blades fixed into handles, forming efficient cutting instruments. Later, a surprising alternative appeared: harvesting blades made from clay. Though fragile, they were cheap and easy to produce using abundant local materials. Eventually, composite tools returned, combining sharp stone blades with wooden handles. Over time, these were replaced by metal versions, especially copper tools, which proved more durable and effective. Metal tools represented a significant improvement, and large institutions often played a central role in introducing them. Temples and palaces possessed greater access to resources, labor, and imported materials. They could invest in metal production and distribute improved equipment to their workers. They also promoted the development of new farming technologies, such as advanced plows and more efficient agricultural implements. Because these organizations controlled large estates and workforces, they were often the first to adopt innovations that increased productivity. Metalworking itself became one of the most important specialized crafts of the ancient world. Producing metal objects required knowledge, equipment, and skill that could not easily be reproduced in every household. Metalworkers transformed raw materials into tools, weapons, and ritual objects that reshaped agriculture, warfare, and transportation. Archaeological discoveries provide glimpses into this world of production. Collections of tools found in temple contexts suggest that metal implements were regularly gathered, repaired, and recycled. Metal was too valuable to waste. Broken objects were melted down and reshaped into new tools. The value of the raw material remained constant, even as individual objects changed form. This practice meant that many metal artifacts rarely survived long enough to be buried intact, since they were repeatedly reused. The techniques of metal production developed gradually. Early copper working eventually expanded to include new alloys, improving strength and durability. Skilled artisans mastered casting methods, shaping molten metal in molds to produce complex forms. Some surviving objects show remarkable craftsmanship, revealing a high level of technical expertise. Large institutions likely maintained workshops staffed by trained specialists, although evidence for these workshops is limited. At the same time, smaller-scale production probably continued in private settings, especially for simpler items. The balance between institutional and private production varied over time. In earlier periods, temples may have served as the main centres of craft production, while later, royal administrations sometimes played a larger role. Yet independent craftsmen also existed. Some were hired for specific tasks when needed, while others operated outside institutional control. Evidence suggests that certain crafts remained within the reach of ordinary households, especially when they relied on materials easily obtained from the local environment. The availability of raw materials strongly influenced how crafts were organized. Activities using readily available resources, such as reedworking or simple woodworking, could be carried out at home. More complex crafts, particularly those involving imported materials like metals or rare stones, were more likely to be controlled by large organizations capable of securing supplies through trade. Despite the importance of private craftsmen, their activities are difficult to observe. Written records primarily document institutional operations, leaving independent production largely invisible. It is unclear whether craftsmen formed organized guilds or professional associations. Some occupations were linked to particular divine patrons, suggesting shared traditions or identities. But direct evidence of formal organization is limited. Skills may have been passed down within families, although clear examples are rare. Large institutions possessed advantages beyond access to resources. They could coordinate large projects that required significant investment and collective effort. Shipbuilding provides a clear example. Simple watercraft could be constructed by ordinary families using reeds and natural materials. However, large cargo vessels required timber, specialized skills, and organized labor. Such ships were typically commissioned by public authorities, reflecting the scale of investment involved. Institutional organization also encouraged innovation. When craftsmen worked within a stable system that provided materials and economic support, they could experiment and refine techniques. Over time, practical knowledge developed into shared expertise. This knowledge was transmitted through training and practice, shaping traditions that extended beyond the institutions themselves. Some technical knowledge was preserved through educational exercises. Mathematics, for example, played a vital role in administration, construction, and engineering. Measuring land, calculating volumes, and planning structures required advanced numerical skills. Surveyors determined field boundaries, engineers calculated labor requirements for large projects, and builders designed complex architectural plans. The precision seen in temple construction reflects careful planning and technical understanding. Institutional craft production often operated through centralized administration. Workshops were organized into departments responsible for different materials and products. Officials managed labor, distributed raw materials, and controlled finished goods. Records show the wide range of items handled by these systems, from luxury materials to everyday supplies such as textiles, oils, plants, and construction resources. Production was carefully monitored, and efforts were made to standardize processes and outputs. Among all industries, textile production was particularly significant. Cloth manufacturing required large numbers of workers and constant organization. Vast quantities of wool were processed in state workshops, employing thousands of individuals, many of them women and children. Production was highly structured, with detailed records of labor time, material usage, and product quality. Different grades of cloth were distinguished, and work was divided into specialized stages. These large workshops represent one model of labor organization, but they were not the only form of work in society. Other tasks required temporary or seasonal labor rather than permanent employment. Agricultural work, construction projects, and public infrastructure demanded large numbers of workers at specific times. Communities organized collective labor for harvests, irrigation maintenance, and building projects. Some forms of work could also be performed independently. Tasks such as grinding grain or making bricks were routine activities carried out by individual households. However, institutions sometimes organized these same activities on a larger scale, mobilizing groups of workers and providing compensation. Labor arrangements varied widely. Some workers were hired temporarily and paid for specific tasks. Others served regularly and received provisions such as grain, oil, or cloth. Payment systems did not always indicate social status. Receiving rations did not necessarily mean a person was unfree. Instead, regular provision often reflected long-term service relationships. Evidence suggests that many workers alternated between institutional service and independent activity. Individuals might serve for a limited period each year, receiving support during that time, and then return to their own occupations. This system allowed institutions to mobilize labor when needed, while allowing workers to maintain personal economic activity. Large workforces could include people from diverse backgrounds. Some were prisoners of war, others were farmers, artisans, or ordinary residents temporarily assigned to service. Many had families and did not live permanently under institutional control. This complexity challenges earlier assumptions that state labor forces consisted primarily of unfree workers. Textile workshops provide a clear example of organized labor. Records show detailed calculations of the time required to produce a single garment, dividing the process into numerous stages such as preparation, weaving, finishing, and inspection. Such precision reflects an advanced system of labor management and productivity measurement. Information about employment conditions often comes from wage records. These documents reveal the types of payments issued, the frequency of compensation, and distinctions among workers based on age, skill, or responsibility. Higher quality work and supervisory roles received greater rewards. Yet the broader economic situation of workers depended on whether they had additional sources of income outside institutional employment. Overall, the economic system of early Mesopotamia was not rigidly divided between free and unfree labor, nor between public and private production. Instead, it was a complex structure combining institutional organization, private enterprise, seasonal service, and specialized expertise. Large organizations coordinated major projects and controlled valuable resources, while households and independent workers continued to play essential roles in production. In the kingdoms that followed earlier Mesopotamian states, many older systems of labor and social obligation continued, though often under new names. Rulers inherited administrative traditions that tied certain groups of people to service for the state, especially in return for access to land or protection. one social group in particular occupied an unusual position within this structure. They stood somewhere between fully free citizens and enslaved individuals, forming a middle category that played an important role in the economic and political life of the kingdom. This group has often been described as semi-free. Its members were typically connected to the land they cultivated and were required to perform duties for royal authority. These duties did not necessarily prevent them from earning income through private activity, and their status appears to have been more flexible than legal texts sometimes suggest. Social boundaries were not always rigid. Even individuals who were legally free could owe obligations to the state, showing that service was not limited to a single class. One of the main forms of obligation was a system of temporary service. Individuals holding land granted by the state were required to provide labour or military participation when called upon. This arrangement linked political authority directly to economic resources. The right to cultivate land was balanced by the duty to serve the ruler. Such service could involve military campaigns, but it also included public works, administration, and other forms of state activity. The system functioned as a method of organising manpower while reinforcing loyalty to the central authority. These duties were closely connected to landholding. Property granted by the palace often carried expectations of service, creating a structure in which political power, economic production, and military organisation were tightly linked. The arrangement resembles systems found in many later societies, where land ownership was exchanged for service obligations. Over time, such duties were often inherited by family members, passing from one generation to the next. This inheritance could create tensions, as families sought ways to avoid or reduce their responsibilities, while retaining the benefits of land. Legal regulations attempted to control these arrangements. Certain individuals were prohibited from selling land tied to service obligations, while others were allowed to transfer their holdings. Attempts to bypass obligations sometimes took the form of hiring substitutes. Individuals might pay another person to perform their required service, effectively turning duty into a transferable burden. Despite efforts by rulers to prevent such practices, they continued to appear, suggesting that economic pressures and social realities often reshaped official policy. Records from various regions reveal that governments carefully monitored those liable for service. Lists were compiled identifying individuals, their locations, and their responsibilities. Some documents even record attempts by people to evade their duties by leaving their homes or relocating to other regions. Such evidence illustrates the constant negotiation between state authority and individual interest. Military service formed one of the most important aspects of these obligations. Warfare was a regular feature of political life in ancient Mesopotamia. Cities competed for territory, resources, and influence, while external threats required organised defence. Maintaining military forces required careful planning and constant recruitment, and systems of conscription ensured that large numbers of men could be mobilised when necessary. Early visual and written evidence shows that organised conflict was present from the earliest urban periods. Scenes of battle, prisoners, and armed soldiers appear in art and inscriptions, indicating that warfare was deeply embedded in political culture. While professional soldiers may have existed, armies also depended heavily on ordinary citizens who were summoned during times of crisis. Farmers, labourers, and craftsmen could all be called upon to fight when required. Over time, more structured military organisations developed. Some rulers maintained permanent forces, while others formed specialised units, drawn from particular regions or communities. Military service could be organised through local authorities, who were responsible for supplying soldiers when the state demanded them. This system allowed rulers to mobilise manpower without maintaining a large standing army at all times. The relationship between military service and landholding remained central. Individuals granted state land were expected to defend the state in return. This arrangement ensured a steady supply of soldiers while strengthening the connection between political authority and economic production. The obligation was not merely a burden, but also a form of participation in the protection and expansion of the state. Military forces were not uniform. Different groups served in different capacities, reflecting their social background, environment, and skills. Some soldiers were trained for direct combat, while others performed support roles, such as transport, communication, or supply management. Certain communities preserved older traditions of military service, based on tribal identity or regional loyalty, contributing distinctive units to the army. The diversity of military organization reflects the complexity of Mesopotamian society. Urban populations, rural communities, and nomadic groups all contributed to military activity in different ways. Nomadic groups, accustomed to mobility and harsh environments, often developed lighter equipment and greater flexibility. Settled agricultural communities, with access to resources and workshops, produced heavier weapons and more elaborate military equipment. Weapons and equipment varied widely. Early armies relied heavily on infantry armed with spears, axes, and other close combat weapons. Shields and protective clothing provided defense, while ranged weapons such as bows and slings offered additional tactical options. Vehicles drawn by animals also appeared in battle, serving both practical and symbolic functions. These vehicles, often associated with elite warriors, reflected status as much as military effectiveness. Technological limitations shaped the nature of warfare. Metal weapons were valuable and frequently recycled, meaning that few examples survive today. Protective armor was often made from organic materials, such as leather rather than metal. Only later developments introduced more advanced weaponry and defensive equipment. Conflict took many forms. Armies met in open battle, raided enemy territory, or laid siege to fortified cities. Control of agricultural land was often a central objective. A city's survival depended on its surrounding fields, irrigation systems, and food supplies. Destroying crops or blocking access to resources could weaken an opponent without direct confrontation. Seasonal cycles influenced military campaigns. Agricultural societies could not commit their entire population to warfare during critical periods, such as planting or harvest. This created strategic constraints, shaping the timing of military operations. In contrast, mobile groups without fixed agricultural responsibilities possessed greater freedom of movement, allowing them to act unpredictably. Large-scale campaigns sometimes covered vast distances. Alliances between distant regions brought armies together across wide territories. Communication networks developed to support these activities. Messengers carried information. Routes were carefully planned, and intelligence was gathered through informants. Rapid communication could determine the success or failure of military operations. Siege warfare became a defining feature of ancient conflict. Cities protected themselves with massive walls, and attackers developed methods to overcome these defenses. Siege towers, battering devices, and earthen ramps allowed armies to approach and breach fortifications. The construction of such equipment required significant resources and technical knowledge, demonstrating the level of organization achieved by ancient states. Victories brought rewards as well as destruction. Conquered cities were plundered, and valuable goods were distributed among the victors. A portion of the spoils was often dedicated to religious institutions, reflecting the belief that success in war depended on divine favor. Such offerings reinforce the connection between political power and religious authority. Human captives formed one of the most significant results of warfare. Prisoners could be enslaved, relocated, or used as labor. Some were integrated into the economic system, performing agricultural or industrial work. Others were held for diplomatic purposes, serving as bargaining tools in negotiations between states. The treatment of captives varied. Some were executed, while others were resettled or forced into service. Systems of control were developed to manage large numbers of prisoners, reflecting the practical challenges of maintaining authority over conquered populations. The presence of foreign captives also influenced social and economic structures within the conquering state. War did not always lead to permanent hostility. Diplomatic efforts often followed conflict, establishing agreements that regulated relations between states. These agreements addressed issues such as the return of prisoners, property disputes, and the movement of people across borders. They also defined obligations and limitations intended to prevent future conflict. Diplomacy relied heavily on ritual and religious sanction. Agreements were often confirmed through solemn oaths, invoking divine witnesses to guarantee compliance. Breaking such oaths was considered both a political betrayal and a religious offense. Despite these measures, alliances remained fragile and could shift rapidly in response to changing circumstances. International relations involved continuous negotiation. Messengers traveled between courts carrying proposals, demands, and information. Gifts were exchanged as symbols of goodwill or expressions of political expectation. Marriage alliances created lasting connections between ruling families, linking the interests of different states. Political power in the ancient Near East therefore rested on a balance of force and negotiation. Military strength ensured survival, while diplomacy shaped relationships between competing powers. Systems of service, landholding, and social obligations supported both war and peace, forming the foundation of state authority. In the ancient societies of Mesopotamia, political authority was never understood as a simple matter of power or control. Leadership required recognition, legitimacy, and acceptance by both the people and the divine forces believed to govern the world. When representatives of different states met in negotiation, authority had to be clearly embodied in the person who spoke for each side. Yet the nature of this authority differed widely depending on the traditions and social structures from which rulers emerged. Among tribal societies, especially those with nomadic roots, leadership often followed kinship and inherited hierarchy. Authority rested on family lineage and personal loyalty. In contrast, the older urban civilizations of Mesopotamia developed a more complex understanding of power. Their political culture was closely intertwined with religious belief, creating a system in which governance and divine order were inseparable. Religion did not exist as a separate sphere of life, but functioned as the language through which political power was explained and justified. Historical events were described through religious imagery. Victories, disasters, and changes in leadership were presented as expressions of divine will. Such language was not merely symbolic. It shaped how authority was understood and exercised. Ideas about territory, dynastic continuity, popular approval, and tribal identity all formed part of a broader worldview that explained the structure of society. Written accounts might reflect genuine belief, scholarly interpretation, or deliberate propaganda, yet all reveal the importance placed on tradition and precedent. Political thought was therefore not simply an explanation of power, but an essential element of the social system itself, shaping how people understood their world. The nature of rulership in early Mesopotamia reflects this complexity. Different cities used different titles for their leaders, and these titles carried distinct meanings. Some rulers held positions connected with religious office, others exercised military or political authority, and some claimed supremacy over neighbouring states. Despite these differences, the essential function of the ruler remained the same: to maintain order, ensure prosperity, and represent the community before the gods. The installation of a ruler was marked by elaborate ceremonial rituals. Ancient traditions described kingship as a sacred institution brought down from the heavens and symbolized by objects representing authority. These included the crown, the staff of command, and the throne. These symbols appeared in art, ritual texts, and royal ceremonies, emphasizing that power was granted rather than seized. Visual representations of rulers often distinguished them through specific clothing, headdresses, and postures, marking their unique status within society. The formal installation of a ruler usually took place within a temple, highlighting the connection between political authority and divine approval. The ceremony involved receiving the symbols of rule, assuming a new identity, and publicly affirming the leader's role as protector of the people. Administrative records confirm that such ceremonies were accompanied by offerings and sacrifices, demonstrating that these rituals were not symbolic inventions, but real events embedded in political life. Once installed, the ruler carried out duties that combined religious obligation with political responsibility. One of the most visible tasks involved presenting offerings to the gods. These acts were more than religious devotion. By making offerings on behalf of the community, the ruler asserted authority and claimed the favor of divine powers. Prosperity, successful harvests, and social stability were interpreted as signs of divine approval, and the ruler received credit for securing these blessings. Another major responsibility involved the construction and maintenance of temples. Royal inscriptions frequently describe the rebuilding of sacred structures, the decoration of sanctuaries, and the installation of divine images. These projects required vast resources and collective effort, often involving the participation of the entire population. By restoring temples and providing for religious institutions, rulers reinforced both spiritual devotion and political legitimacy. Rulers also participated directly in ritual life. Some ceremonies were regular festivals marking the cycle of the year, while others were performed in response to unusual events or ominous signs. These rituals were believed to maintain cosmic balance and ensure the continued prosperity of the land. Participation in such ceremonies reinforced the ruler's role as mediator between humanity and the divine world. One of the most striking rituals associated with kingship was the sacred marriage ceremony. In this rite, the ruler symbolically united with a goddess in a ritual act intended to guarantee fertility and abundance. The ceremony involved elaborate preparation, music, offerings, and formal representation of divine union. Through this act, the ruler embodied a divine role, reinforcing the belief that political authority reflected cosmic order. In some cases, rulers went further, claiming divine status themselves. Such claims were expressed through royal titles, religious symbols, and acts of worship directed toward the king. Temples could be dedicated to living rulers, and offerings were made to their statues. Yet even when kings were treated as divine figures, distinctions remained between human rulers and traditional gods. The ruler's divinity was closely tied to political circumstances, particularly when new forms of political unity required new forms of ideological justification. The relationship between divine order and political power formed the foundation of Mesopotamian political thought. Each city believed itself protected by a patron deity, and the fortunes of the city reflected the favour or displeasure of this divine protector. Military success indicated divine approval, while defeat suggested divine abandonment. Political change was therefore interpreted as a reflection of events in the divine realm. The selection of a ruler was often explained as the result of divine choice. Texts describe gods choosing leaders, guiding their birth, or granting them authority. These claims served to legitimize power, especially when a ruler did not inherit the throne through established succession. At the same time, some traditions recognized the role of popular approval. Assemblies of citizens could support or reject a leader, and rulers emphasized their acceptance by the people as evidence of legitimacy. Different traditions of authority sometimes coexisted. Urban societies emphasized territorial control and religious sanction, while tribal traditions emphasized family lineage and personal loyalty. As new groups entered the political landscape, their traditions were incorporated into existing systems. New deities could be introduced, and myths created to explain political change. These developments demonstrate how flexible Mesopotamian ideology could be in adapting to new circumstances. Relations between states were also shaped by religious concepts. Diplomatic agreements were confirmed by oaths invoking divine witnesses. Political alliances could be represented through symbolic rituals, and contributions to major temples expressed loyalty to shared cultural institutions. Even warfare was interpreted through religious imagery, with victories attributed to divine support and defeats explained as divine judgment. The political order operated on several levels. Individual cities possessed their own rulers and institutions, yet broader cultural unity existed across regions. Certain deities were associated with supreme authority, representing the idea of universal kingship. When rulers achieved dominance over large territories, their power was explained through this broader framework, presenting their rule as part of a divinely ordained order. Despite the strong emphasis on ideology, practical political considerations remained important. Conquerors faced decisions about whether to annex territory directly or allow local autonomy. Diplomatic correspondence reveals discussions of strategy, negotiation, and political calculation that existed alongside religious explanations of power. Authority depended not only on divine approval, but also on the ability to maintain order and secure cooperation. The responsibility of the ruler extended beyond warfare and ritual into the administration of justice. The king was regarded as the ultimate guardian of fairness and social order. Legal reforms, economic regulation, and protection of the weak were presented as essential duties of leadership. The ruler was portrayed as a shepherd caring for the people, ensuring stability and prosperity through wise governance. Beneath the ideology of kingship existed a structured legal system designed to regulate daily life. Judicial institutions performed several essential functions. They resolved disputes between individuals, punished offences against society, enforced government regulations, and recorded legally binding agreements. These tasks were carried out through a hierarchy of authority, extending from local communities to the king himself. At the local level, councils of elders and community leaders played a central role. These groups possessed knowledge of local conditions and could investigate disputes within their communities. They examined evidence, questioned witnesses, and attempted to resolve conflicts. Their authority reflected the importance of communal participation in maintaining social order. More complex cases could be referred to higher authorities. Judges appointed by the state presided over formal proceedings, often within temple complexes or public assemblies. These courts examined evidence, heard testimony, and issued judgments recorded in written documents. The existence of professional judges indicates an advanced system of legal administration. At the highest level stood the ruler, who served as the supreme judge. Serious cases or appeals could be brought before him, and he possessed the authority to confirm or overturn decisions. Although the ruler did not personally handle every case, his position at the top of the judicial hierarchy symbolized the unity of political and legal authority. Legal procedures demonstrate a clear effort to establish truth through investigation. Courts relied on witness testimony, written records, and physical evidence. Statements were examined, documents verified, and witnesses recalled when necessary. Even damaged records could be restored and used as evidence. This careful process reflects an early commitment to systematic legal practice. The administration of justice therefore formed an essential part of Mesopotamian society. It provided mechanisms for resolving conflict, maintaining order, and reinforcing authority. Although legal codes described ideal principles, everyday practice depended on institutions, procedures, and social participation. Through this complex network of religious belief, political authority, ritual practice, and legal organization, ancient Mesopotamian societies created a system in which power was both sacred and practical. Authority required divine approval, public recognition, and effective administration. The ruler stood at the center of this system, serving as mediator between gods and people, guardian of justice, and symbol of social order. In ancient Mesopotamia, the search for truth in a courtroom was not based only on human judgment. Justice was believed to exist at the meeting point between earthly authority and divine power. When witnesses spoke before judges, they swore solemn oaths, much like in modern courts. This practice was so routine that ancient records rarely bothered to mention it. Oaths were also common in everyday agreements, where individuals promised not to challenge a transaction or deny their obligations. These promises carried both legal and spiritual weight. Yet when ordinary testimony could not resolve a dispute, the legal system turned to stronger measures. When evidence conflicted or when no witnesses existed, judges called upon divine authority to determine the truth. One method involved a ritual declaration in which a person swore innocence before a god. This practice relied on a powerful belief that divine punishment would strike anyone who spoke falsely. Fear of supernatural retribution served as a powerful force in maintaining honesty. These declarations were not simply private acts of faith. They formed part of official legal procedure. Courts determined when such an oath would be required, and a person's willingness or refusal to take it became evidence in itself. The refusal to swear before the gods could be interpreted as an admission of guilt, while acceptance of the oath signaled confidence in one's claim. Such practices often concerned matters known only to the individual involved, situations where no outside testimony could exist. Many types of disputes relied on these solemn declarations. Questions of inheritance, business agreements, and agricultural arrangements frequently involved situations where only one party knew the truth. If a shepherd claimed that sheep had died from illness or had been killed by wild animals in remote pastures, he might clear himself by swearing before a deity. Once the oath was taken, the owner of the flock was expected to accept the loss as unavoidable. This approach reflected a long tradition. For centuries, individuals accused of negligence or dishonesty could declare their innocence in a sacred space. In cases where both sides presented conflicting testimony and no other evidence existed, judges might send the accused to a temple to swear before divine symbols. Sometimes, the threat alone was enough. Individuals who knew themselves guilty might refuse to take the oath, rather than risk divine punishment. The oath itself was usually performed using sacred objects associated with particular gods. These might include religious emblems, symbolic weapons, or sacred animals representing divine authority. In some disputes, especially those involving property, judges arranged for the divine symbol to be brought directly to the location of the conflict. There, the parties swore their declarations on the spot, transforming the physical setting into a sacred space of judgment. Over time, such rituals also became part of economic life. Sacred symbols travelled through temple lands, and tenants were required to swear declarations about their harvests before divine emblems. These ceremonies not only reinforced religious authority, but also strengthened institutional control over resources and property. Even stronger than the oath was a dramatic procedure known as the river ordeal. This method combined judgment and punishment in a single act. When serious accusations could not be proven by ordinary means, the accused was subjected to a test involving the river. Survival was interpreted as proof of innocence, while failure was taken as evidence of guilt. Such trials were reserved for grave accusations such as sorcery, adultery, or murder. Earlier periods appear to have used this ordeal more widely, even for disputes over property or debt. Over time, however, its use became restricted to the most serious crimes. The increasing spread of written records likely reduced reliance on such extreme methods. Written agreements provided clearer evidence, making supernatural tests less necessary. Once a case reached its conclusion, the court recorded its decision in official documents. These records summarized the judgment and described the actions required to resolve the dispute. Court officials supervised the enforcement of these decisions, ensuring that penalties were carried out, or that required rituals were performed. Various officials assisted in the administration of justice. Some supervised punishments, others recovered property or enforced court orders. Public messengers announced official decisions and informed communities of legal matters. They also publicized lost seals or stolen property so that fraudulent transactions could be prevented. The legal system therefore relied on a network of administrative roles extending beyond the courtroom itself. Written documents gradually became an important form of evidence in legal proceedings. Although early societies had relied mainly on witnesses and spoken agreements, written records increasingly served as proof that a transaction had taken place. These documents did not create legal rights on their own. Instead, they recorded actions, words, and agreements that had already occurred. A valid transaction required several elements. Certain statements had to be spoken, specific actions performed, and witnesses present. These requirements existed long before writing and continued even after written records became common. Documents simply preserved evidence of events that had already been recognized as legally binding. Formal words played an essential role in many agreements. Legal relationships often depended on spoken declarations recognized by society. Marriage, for example, required an official statement to establish the union. Without such a declaration, the relationship had no legal standing. Similar spoken formulas governed adoption, divorce, and other personal arrangements. Words carried legal power when pronounced before witnesses. Symbolic actions also accompanied many legal transactions. These gestures gave visible expression to agreements and obligations. Certain acts represented the transfer of ownership, the acceptance of responsibility, or the establishment of freedom from claims. A slave might step over a symbolic object to mark a change of status. A guarantor might strike his forehead to show willingness to assume responsibility. The cutting of a garment could signify the end of a relationship, just as other gestures marked its beginning. Such symbolic acts gradually became less important as writing spread. In earlier times, visible ceremonies helped compensate for the absence of permanent records. As written documentation became more common, these rituals slowly disappeared, replaced by written proof. Showed that the individual had personally accepted the transaction. Losing a seal was a serious matter, since anyone could use it fraudulently. Public announcements therefore warned communities when a seal had been lost. Early legal documents reveal how these practices developed. The earliest records of property sales were carved in stone or written on clay tablets, listing the property, the payments made, and the witnesses present. These documents preserved evidence of transactions rather than creating them. Over time, public officials became involved in verifying sales, and written records gained increasing authority. Eventually, sealing a document became a standard method of confirming agreement. The seal transformed a record into a binding legal instrument, proving the consent of the parties involved. This development allowed economic relationships to expand beyond personal trust and local familiarity, making more complex transactions possible. Legal systems also depended on sanctions to enforce compliance. In small communities, social pressure often ensured obedience. As societies grew more complex, enforcement passed into the hands of organized authority. Oaths remained central to this process, reinforced by fear of divine punishment. Breaking a sworn promise was believed to bring severe consequences from both gods and society. Some texts describe terrifying punishments awaiting those who violated their agreements. These threats reflected a world in which divine justice was considered an active force in everyday life. The fear of supernatural retaliation strengthened the authority of legal institutions and encouraged compliance with social norms. Alongside everyday legal practice, rulers issued collections of laws that defined standards of justice within their realms. These texts gathered individual rules and principles rather than presenting a complete system of law. They represented attempts to regulate society, address new conditions, and standardize practices across expanding territories. These collections did not record individual court cases. Instead, they presented general principles intended to guide future decisions. Some rules preserved long-standing traditions, while others responded to contemporary problems. They established guidelines for judges, defined responsibilities, and communicated the ruler's commitment to justice. Such legal reforms also carried political significance. By issuing laws that applied throughout their territories, rulers asserted control and promoted unity. Standardized rules strengthened administrative authority and reinforced the image of the king as guardian of order. Relied on financial compensation for harm, the concept that injury should be repaid with a comparable penalty. Earlier traditions often relied on financial compensation for harm, but later, laws sometimes prescribed physical punishment, reflecting changes in social and political influence. At the same time, these legal traditions preserved older customs. Responsibility for damage or negligence could be determined by comparing outcomes with those of neighbouring farmers or workers. Such practical solutions reflected communal standards of fairness, rooted in everyday experience. The actual impact of these legal collections remains difficult to measure. They represented only part of a broader system of customary law and judicial practice. Yet references to royal ordinances in legal proceedings suggest that these reforms influenced court decisions and shaped the administration of justice. Through this complex blend of ritual, testimony, symbolism, and written record, ancient Mesopotamian society constructed a system of law that combined human judgment with divine authority. Justice depended not only on evidence and procedure, but also on belief in cosmic order. Courts sought truth through investigation, ritual, and documentation, while rulers claimed responsibility for maintaining fairness and stability. Mesopotamian civilization stretches across a span of time that feels almost unmatched. It is not only long-lived, but also unusually continuous in its basic habits and institutions. Dynasties rise and fall. Borders expand and shrink, capitals shine and then fade. Yet many elements of daily life and social structure appear to endure with a stubborn resilience. That kind of continuity can tempt historians into treating the social order as something fixed, with only occasional interruptions. In reality, that is an oversimplification. The deeper story is not only about who ruled, but about how political power interacted with communities, households, temples, palaces, villages, merchants and farmers, and how these forces together produced the changes visible in the record. Long-term trends are often asserted with confidence, but they frequently rest on instinct more than measurable proof. Some scholars once pictured early southern Mesopotamia as a landscape dominated entirely by temples, as if cities were simply religious estates run from sacred centers. Later interpretations pushed back, giving greater weight to the household, the extended family, and the local community as the real foundations of society. Still, other voices argued that even the temple's great authority may not reach back as early as some once assumed. A similar debate surrounds the idea that private property expanded rapidly after the collapse of a strong, centralized kingdom. That claim can sound persuasive, but it may also reflect the uneven survival of documents. Private records are scarce in some periods and abundant in others, while palace archives appear and vanish unpredictably. The same caution applies to social categories of labor and freedom. What looks like a major shift in classes may partly be an illusion created by which texts survive, which institutions kept records, and which archives remain buried. Because so many conclusions depend on the accidental balance of surviving evidence, it makes more sense to focus on the processes that can actually be observed in motion and on the mechanisms by which change could happen, rather than declaring any single trend absolute. The most dramatic drivers of change were the recurring breakdowns of political order, those intervals when centralized authority dissolved, dynasties ended, and the state's reach shrank to almost nothing. These periods were not rare exceptions. They were structural shocks that returned again and again. When the state weakens, social systems that rely on coordinated protection, storage, redistribution, and enforcement begin to unravel. The effect is especially visible at the edges of the ecological system, in zones where agriculture survives, only under delicate conditions. In northern Mesopotamia, where rainfall agriculture is possible but uncertain, the border between workable farmland and failure can shift rapidly. A small change in rainfall patterns can erase settlement from a wide zone, and archaeological surveys show cycles of intense occupation, followed by near-empty landscapes. Climate may play a role, but politics matters just as much. Marginal farming is sustainable only when it is backed by stronger zones. Large landowners typically spread risk, anchoring their wealth in dependable heartlands near major cities, while investing in riskier outer lands. A state can do the same on a larger scale, supporting frontier agriculture through surplus, storage, security, and the ability to move resources when crisis hits. The state can guard granaries, protect standing crops, and keep harvests from being seized during unrest. Private networks can also provide support, through family ties or contractual bonds, linking a marginal farmer with a landlord or kin in a safer district. But farmers isolated in the danger zone have little buffer. 1 or 2 bad years, or the collapse of local security, can force them to abandon the land. Some will drift toward a more mobile life with whatever livestock remains, others will seek refuge in upland niches, and some will move toward urban centres, where survival depends less directly on rainfall. In the south, the mechanisms differ, but the vulnerability is just as real. Irrigation agriculture can survive local turbulence if canals are maintained at a basic level, by traditional authorities. And later observers have noted that small-scale canal administration can be surprisingly local. That fact has sometimes been used to argue that a powerful centralized state was not strictly necessary to keep water flowing. Yet this does not mean the landscape remains unchanged when central authority collapses. Where irrigation projects were tied directly to state planning, where canals crossed wider districts beyond local control, or where the system depended on a large coordinated labour force, deterioration could be rapid. Marginal lands at the edges of irrigation networks would be abandoned first. Specialised cultivation that depended on stable demand and reliable large employers would collapse. Fields that required large-scale water engineering or long-range coordination would suffer. Rural society might fall back on a minimal default system, but the overall regime would shrink and harden, leaving many zones empty. These dramatic collapses also operate alongside slower, quieter spirals of decline. A farming system can erode without a single spectacular disaster. Poor irrigation, soil exhaustion, salinity, and falling yields can trap both tenants and landlords in an escalating crisis. If a tenant's share falls too low, departure becomes rational, even if it means leaving debts behind. Unless coercive power is unusually strong, nothing can fully stop that movement. The ancient record contains hints of fugitives and displaced people who sought new livelihoods elsewhere, as well as groups who turned to outlaw life on the margins of settled society. When tenants vanish, landlords are left with declining land and no labour to work it. The irony is that tenants attached to large institutions or major owners may sometimes be less vulnerable than small independent farmers. A powerful landlord can shift a tenant from one field to another if a specific plot becomes saline or loses water, because holdings are spread across regions. The small farmer has no such flexibility. When yields fall, the only immediate option is to press harder. Sow more densely, reduce fallow time, cultivate too frequently. That short-term response worsens soil exhaustion and salinity, accelerating the path toward ruin. In the south, political unrest therefore often produces widespread abandonment of smaller settlements and villages. Archaeology shows this pattern, and texts also suggest it through references to resettlement policies, to rulers returning dispersed people, and to newly founded rural sites that carry the names of individual founders or owners. After a period of instability, countryside can be repopulated in a way that looks both familiar and newly rearranged. In northern Assyria, families created rural outposts, named after the original settlers. In the southern plains, early second millennium landscapes show settlements named, as if they were new foundations rather than inherited towns, and some names suggest origins in newly settled nomadic groups. These new villages may follow the logic of canals and fields, rather than any older pattern of ownership, meaning continuity in water management can coexist with discontinuity in who controls the land. City-based families may slowly reassert older claims, while incoming groups establish themselves in fringe zones, producing a complex mosaic. The difficulty is that the passage of time in archaeology is often too thinly resolved to separate one political transition from another. Some breaks are invisible unless settlement patterns are studied as patterns, not as isolated sites. Two different periods of stable rule may produce countryside layouts that look similar on the ground. Only the abandonment of one network of villages and the appearance of another can reveal an interval of disorder between them. In some cases, surveys seem to show two comparable systems layered in sequence, but full confidence requires tighter, chronological control than pottery sequences often provide. Ancient literature shows that people were intensely aware of what political breakdown meant. When order collapses, poems describe not only military defeat, but the shutting down of ordinary life. Fields left unsown, herds untended, food offerings disrupted, familiar neighborhoods emptied, strangers occupying places once safe. These descriptions move between politics and nature, as if the cosmic order itself has been disturbed. Flood stories and famine traditions do something similar, picturing disaster as a divine decision that disrupts both landscape and society. In some narratives, the gods decide that human noise and prosperity have grown too great, and destruction becomes the method of restoring balance. The rebuilding of order is then paired with imagined controls on future population growth. Whether population pressure truly posed a decisive threat is difficult to prove without better measures of agricultural capacity and household structure. Archaeology sometimes suggests that settlement growth outpaced what natural increase could produce, raising the possibility of immigration. But the constant interchange between settled farming and mobile lifestyles makes any simple demographic reading uncertain. When stability returns, the question becomes how much of the old order survives and how much is reshaped. One observable pattern in stable regimes is standardization. Powerful states repeatedly try to impose uniformity on administration, trade, law, and measurement. Standard weights and measures, calendars, transport systems, scribal training, accounting practices, and bureaucratic formats often become tools of control. The benefits of uniformity are practical. Legal norms become consistent, taxation becomes predictable, trade becomes easier, and state authority becomes visible in daily life. Even when new moral codes clash with older urban habits, the drive toward a single norm remains strong. Once a standardized system is installed, bureaucracies tend to preserve it, slowing the pace of change. This standardizing force is not limited to official life. Within stable borders, travel becomes safer, exchange becomes more regular, and central standards become socially attractive. People move more easily across the realm, and the state itself relocates administrators and soldiers, carrying habits, tastes, and techniques into new regions. Over time, this can produce visible similarities in writing styles, linguistic norms, artistic preferences, and technology. Even without explicit commands, a single political space encourages cultural convergence. The reverse process appears during instability, fragmentation, and divergence. Horizons shrink, central enforcement fades. Precision in measurement becomes a luxury when survival is uncertain. Without safe roads and stable markets, the incentives for standardized packaging and dependable quality decline. Courts lose strength, policing weakens, and fraud becomes harder to suppress. Commerce contracts, administration breaks into local cells, and even those local structures may collapse if they were staffed by dependents of the fallen regime. With insecurity, economic fear, and population movement, the social world becomes more varied, more local, and less uniform. These dynamics likely shaped material culture more deeply than is often acknowledged. Pottery styles and production methods, which form the backbone of archaeological chronology, would naturally respond to the rise and fall of centralized control. Under strong regimes, luxury goods and standardized containers might spread. Under disorder, luxury production would shrink, local sizes and forms would diverge, and household-based production would become more prominent. Over time, techniques could separate into distinct local traditions. Mesopotamia's long timeline and tight environmental constraints make it an ideal setting for studying how political structure drives material uniformity and material diversity. But the research demands a finer, more systematic approach than has often been applied. Despite all these disruptions, Mesopotamian civilization maintained coherence for millennia. The strongest forces of cultural conservatism were anchored in cities, especially in scribal tradition. Later, kings boasted of reading ancient inscriptions and restoring temples according to records that reached back centuries, or even more than 1,000 years. Some rulers treated the past as a living authority, searching foundations for ancient deposits, preserving old texts, and honouring earlier kings. Temples were crucial in this continuity because sacred places could survive even when towns faded. Some sites that ceased to function as population centres endured as holy places, marked by temples and cemeteries. Even when major cities declined, their memory could persist in tradition and royal ideology. Yet there remains a major puzzle. During the darkest intervals, written evidence often disappears, and archaeology suggests that some cities were physically abandoned. How could scribal knowledge and urban tradition survive when the institutions that carried them were weakened or temporarily gone? Part of the answer is that not every disruption struck everywhere with the same force. Some regions escaped particular invasions. Some transitions involved takeovers of existing institutions rather than wholesale destruction, meaning scribes and administrators could be absorbed into new regimes. New dynasties had strong incentives to preserve continuity in city life because administration, taxation, and legitimacy depended on it. The most severe breaks appear when abandonment is total, and those breaks may be driven as much by environmental change as by political instability. There is evidence that when a city became unlivable, important cults could be transferred rather than extinguished. Priests moved, rituals continued in new locations, and gods were given new shrines inside the temples of host deities. A sacred tradition could therefore survive even without its original city. In the same way, cults and ritual identities could migrate northward or into safer zones during troubled times, leaving traces in the religious geography of later capitals. This kind of institutional migration helps explain how continuity could be preserved across periods that otherwise look like silence. Temples and palaces also acted as buffers against instability because their resources were large and diverse. As major employers and patrons in agriculture, industry, and trade, they could absorb shocks that would crush small communities. In the long run, institutional power may even have been essential for relocating society when rivers shifted or irrigation systems failed. The capital investment needed to reshape the landscape was beyond the capacity of individual villages. When relocation happened, it likely altered the balance between private and institutional property, because newly opened lands could be assigned through institutional authority, expanding the economic reach of palace or temple. Over the span from the mid-3rd to mid-2nd millennium, there are signs that power shifted in formal ways from temples toward palaces. Sometimes this may have happened by default, because royal regimes could recover faster after disruption. Sometimes it may have been deliberate reform, bringing temples under closer state supervision. In certain periods, secular officials managed temple economies as part of state administration, and judicial functions that had been local or temple-based were pulled into royal courts. Yet this transfer of authority could also move the other way. When the state weakened, other bodies stepped in to hold society together. Merchant organizations, for example, could emerge as powerful regulators of trade and even assume legal or political roles in the absence of firm, centralized control. Across institutions and sectors, procedural habits also migrated. The stubborn survivals of any civilization are often not slogans or royal titles, but the practical ways of doing things. Administrative routines, legal customs, document practices, and collective decision-making traditions. Systems of sealing documents, recording agreements, and formalizing obligations could outlast the dynasties that standardized them. palaces borrowed concepts and land management practices that once belonged mainly to temples. Over time, royal administrations also adopted commercial language and techniques that originated in private trade. Meanwhile, communal governance, the habit of councils and collective deliberation in towns and villages, remained a persistent procedural model, even when political ideology placed initiative firmly in royal hands. Popular consent continued to appear as an important element in legitimation, not necessarily as empty rhetoric, but as the echo of a deeply rooted communal mindset that neither palace nor temple could fully erase. All of this unfolded within a geographical imagination that mattered. The southern alluvial plain was perceived as a distinctive cultural world with clear boundaries, a shared mix of language, urban forms, religious practice, and material habits. Northern and southern differences certainly existed, but the commonalities were stronger. This kind of cultural unity, stronger than any single political state, is familiar from other historical contexts. Independent city-states can still belong to one shared cultural sphere. The question becomes how far that sphere extends. Northern Mesopotamia and Syria were deeply connected through routes and trading centres, and some cities to the north participated actively in the broader Mesopotamian world. Early second millennium diplomacy shows that closely related forms of Akkadian became the language of communication across a huge area, implying a receptive cultural environment shaped by earlier traditions. At the same time, the internal coherence of the southern plain still seems more intense than the links joining north and south. The south appears to be the place where the most extreme forms of literacy, bureaucratic organisation, and urban concentration were developed, and from which these practices spread outward across the Near East. In the end, Mesopotamian history is not simply a sequence of dynasties. It is a long negotiation between stability and collapse, between standardization and local divergence, between institutional power and private survival, between the fragility of agriculture and the stubbornness of urban tradition. Political shocks repeatedly tore at the fabric, yet cities, temples, palaces, and communities found ways to transmit habits, rituals, and administrative culture forward in time. The record that survives is uneven and biased, but the processes can still be traced. Disruption empties the margins, stability refills them. Strong states unify norms, weak states allow divergence. Institutions preserve memory, migration preserves cult, and procedural habits outlive regimes. This is how a civilization can remain recognizable across millennia. Not because nothing changes, but because change itself follows recurring channels, shaped by environment, institutions, and the deep structure of social life.